Hey guys, today we will learn the disgusting ways patients were treated in hospitals in medieval times. Imagine going to the doctor with a headache and being told to drill a hole in your skull, or being covered in leeches to balance your blood. Welcome to medieval medicine, a world where superstition and science collided, and where the cure was often worse than the disease. When we think about medicine today, we imagine hospitals filled with white coats, complex machines, and an understanding of germs, DNA, and human anatomy. But in the Middle Ages, medicine looked very different. It was based not on science as we know it, but on an ancient theory that lasted for centuries. The idea of the four humors. This belief came from the writings of two influential ancient figures, Hippocrates, the Greek physician often called the father of medicine, and Galen, a Roman doctor whose ideas shaped medical thought for over 1,000 years. Their theory was simple, but it became the foundation of medieval health. According to them, the human body was made up of four vital fluids, known as the humors. These were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was thought to be linked to the elements, to the seasons, and even to personality. For example, blood was linked to air and spring. Too much blood made someone sanguine, cheerful, and lively. Phlegm was tied to water in winter. Too much of it made someone calm, slow, and even lazy. Yellow bile was connected to fire in summer. Excess made someone angry and aggressive. Black bile was linked to earth in autumn. Too much made a person melancholic or depressed. If these four humors were in balance, a person would be healthy. But if they fell out of balance, sickness followed. A fever might mean too much blood. A stomachache might mean excess black bile. A cough could be blamed on phlegm. To medieval doctors, this explanation seemed perfectly logical. They did not yet know about bacteria, viruses, or the immune system. Illness was invisible, mysterious, and terrifying. So they leaned on the wisdom of the ancients, passed down for centuries. The theory of humors influenced every treatment in medieval Europe. If you had too much blood, the doctor might remove some. If you had too much phlegm, they might recommend hot, spicy foods to dry it out. If yellow bile was the problem, cooling herbs or special diets were prescribed. And for black bile, purges and strange potions were often given. It wasn't just about treating illness, either. The humors shaped the way people thought about daily life. Diet, exercise, even emotions were tied to this theory. For example, eating certain foods was believed to influence the humors. Red meat might increase blood, while cheese or fish could increase phlegm. Doctors often gave patients long lists of foods to eat or avoid depending on their humoral balance. Seasons also mattered. In summer, yellow bile was more active, so fevers were thought to be more common. In autumn, black bile caused melancholy. Winter was dominated by phlegm, leading to coughs and colds. And spring, with its abundance of blood, was seen as a dangerous time for fevers. The balance of the humors even shaped personality. A person who was lively and optimistic was said to be sanguine, ruled by blood. Someone calm and thoughtful was phlegmatic, quick-tempered. People were choleric, ruled by yellow bile. And quiet, serious types were melancholic, ruled by black bile. These words are still with us today, long after the medical theory faded. It may sound strange to us, but the four humors gave medieval people a sense of order in a chaotic world. Life in the Middle Ages was filled with danger. War, famine, plague, and sudden death. Without modern science, people needed explanations. The four humors offered not just a way to understand sickness, but a way to explain human nature itself. Of course, the theory was deeply flawed. Removing blood did not cure fever. Spicy foods did not reduce phlegm, and melancholy was not caused by black bile in the liver. But in the absence of real knowledge, this system gave medieval doctors something to cling to. It was, in a way, their version of science. A logical framework, even if it was based on error. And so, for hundreds of years, humoral medicine guided treatment across Europe. Doctors, monks, and barbers all used it. Kings and peasants alike trusted it. And from this theory came some of the most infamous practices of medieval medicine, beginning with one of the most disgusting of all, bloodletting. If the four humors formed the foundation of medieval medicine, then bloodletting was its most infamous practice. To medieval doctors, it was the most reliable way to restore balance in the body. To us, it sounds horrifying. Imagine walking into a physician's chamber with nothing more than a headache, only to be strapped down, cut open, and drained of blood. Yet for centuries, this was seen as the height of medical science. The logic was straightforward. If sickness was caused by too much of one humor, especially blood, then the obvious solution was to take some out. Fever, too much blood. Swelling, too much blood. Even something as ordinary as indigestion or fatigue might be blamed on an excess of blood. And so, The treatment was simple. Open a vein, release the blood, and let the body. There were two main ways this was done. The first, and perhaps the most infamous, was through the use of leeches. These slimy little creatures were prized by medieval healers, who saw them as natural, almost magical, surgeons. A physician or barber surgeon might keep jars of leeches in his workshop, ready to be pressed onto the skin of a patient. Once attached, the leech would bite down, secrete a substance that thinned the blood, and then suck until it was full. The second method was more direct: venesection, cutting into a vein with a knife or a lancet and letting the blood flow out into a bowl. This was a common sight in towns and villages. A barber might sharpen his blade, tie a cord around the patient's arm to make the veins bulge, and then make a swift cut. The blood would flow until the barber judged enough had been taken. Sometimes, cups were applied afterward, heated to create suction, drawing yet more blood from the wound. It's worth noting that the red and white striped barber's pole, a symbol still seen today outside barbershops, comes directly from this practice. The red represents blood, the white represents bandages, and the pole itself recalls the stick that patients would grip as their veins were opened. A reminder of just how closely the worlds of grooming and surgery were once connected. To modern ears, this all sounds barbaric, and in many cases it was. Patients who were already weak from illness might be pushed over the edge by losing too much blood. There are stories of people fainting, going into shock, or even dying during the procedure. Yet to medieval minds, these were unfortunate accidents, not evidence that the practice was harmful. The theory was too deeply ingrained to be questioned. Bloodletting was not just a treatment for the sick, it was also used as prevention. Some people underwent seasonal bloodletting to stay healthy. In spring, when blood was thought to be especially active, physicians often recommended draining it before it could cause fevers. Nobles sometimes scheduled regular sessions, much like modern people might schedule check. The practice reached the highest levels of society. Kings, queens, and popes all underwent bloodletting at one time or another. In fact, it is believed that several historical figures may have died because of it. One famous case is that of George Washington, long after the Middle Ages, but still under the sway of humoral theory. In 1799, when he developed a throat infection, doctors drained an astonishing 5 pints of his blood in just a single day. He died shortly after, almost certainly from the treatment rather than the illness. Back in the medieval world, bloodletting was also a communal event. Picture a small town where a traveling barber surgeon sets up shop. Villagers line up, each waiting for their turn to have a vein opened. Some hope it will cure their aches and pains. Others simply want to cleanse themselves of bad blood. Bowls of dark steaming blood sit by the barber's stool, while flies buzz around. For those watching, it was both familiar and disturbing, a reminder of the fragility of health. Yet, despite the gruesome imagery, there was also a kind of ritual to it. Physicians consulted detailed charts that showed the best veins to cut for different ailments. These charts also indicated the best times of year, and even the phases of the moon, for bloodletting. For example, if you had liver problems, a doctor might choose to open a vein near your right arm. For headaches, the temple or the forehead. The alignment of the stars and planets might be consulted before deciding on the exact moment to begin. Leeches, too, were treated almost like valuable medical instruments. They were collected from ponds and marshes, stored in jars, and sold to physicians across Europe. Women, especially poor women, sometimes made a living gathering leeches with their bare legs, standing in shallow water until the creatures attached themselves, then carefully removing them for sale. It was dangerous work, but profitable. The popularity of leeches lasted well beyond the Middle Ages. In fact, during the 19th century, there was a full-blown craze in Europe, with millions of leeches harvested and used in hospitals. But in the medieval period, their appeal lay in the fact that they seemed less violent than knives. A leech's bite was small, and it drew blood steadily, often for hours. For some patients, it must have seemed almost gentle compared to the slash of a blade. Of course, neither method actually cured disease. At best, patients might feel a temporary sense of relief, either because of the placebo effect or simply because they were lighter by a pint or two of blood. At worst, the loss of blood left them weaker, more vulnerable to infection, and less able to fight off illness. But medieval people had no way of knowing this. They saw bloodletting work often enough, or thought they did, that the practice endured. And while it may seem strange, bloodletting also carried a symbolic weight. Blood was seen as the essence of life, and to release it was to release the sickness or poison within. In a world where illness was mysterious and often terrifying, that symbolism carried real power. Patients might have felt reassured, believing the bad humor had literally been drained away. It is easy for us, centuries later, to shake our heads at such practices. Yet we should remember that medieval physicians were not cruel. They were doing the best they could with the knowledge they had. To them, bloodletting was not torture, but treatment. And while it often did more harm than good, it was part of a larger system that tried, however imperfectly, to make sense of the human body. Even today, bloodletting has not disappeared entirely. In certain rare conditions, like hemochromatosis, where the body produces too much iron, doctors may still draw blood as treatment. In that narrow sense, medieval medicine stumbled upon a method that, by sheer accident, had some truth to it. But for most patients in the Middle Ages, bloodletting was less a cure than a ritual, one that left behind a trail of weakness, suffering, and sometimes death. As we leave behind the blood-soaked chambers of barber surgeons and leech collectors, our journey through medieval medicine only grows stranger. For blood was not the only humor to be targeted, nor the only substance thought to heal. Beyond knives and leeches lay an entire world of herbs, potions, and bizarre concoctions, remedies that might be soothing or utterly revolting. If bloodletting was the most iconic of medieval medical practices, herbal remedies were the most widespread. Not every village had a barber surgeon with knives or jars of leeches, but every community had herbs, roots, and wild plants growing in fields and hedgerows. To the medieval mind, these plants carried secrets, cures whispered by nature itself, and sometimes believed to be gifts from God. Medicine in the Middle Ages often began in the garden. Monasteries, in particular, cultivated herb gardens filled with plants prized for their healing properties. Monks and nuns recorded their knowledge in texts known as herbals, carefully copying recipes that had been passed down from antiquity. These books were part botany, part superstition, and part cookbook, listing plants alongside their supposed effects on the human body. A fever might be treated with willow bark, which, interestingly, contains salicin, the natural chemical precursor of modern aspirin. Digestive troubles might be soothed with mint. Chamomile was prescribed for sleep and relaxation, while sage was considered almost miraculous. Its very name derived from the Latin salvare, meaning to save. But for every remedy that held a kernel of truth, there were others that veered into the bizarre. Take, for example, the belief that powdered unicorn horn could cure poisoning. Of course, unicorns did not exist, but merchants were more than happy to sell narwhal tusks or rhinoceros horns as substitutes. Wealthy nobles would pay enormous sums for what they believed was a roll. For ordinary villagers, potions might involve more accessible, if revolting, ingredients. A common cure for throat infections was a gargle made from vinegar, honey, and crushed onions. Another recommended treatment for jaundice was to swallow a potion containing ground-up earthworms, and for those suffering from nosebleeds, one prescription suggested stuffing the nostrils with lint soaked in pig's fat. Animals often played a role in these concoctions. The fat of a goose might be rubbed on aching joints. The bile of an ox could be mixed into a potion to treat failing eyesight. Sometimes, the cure required something even stranger: powdered dog skulls, dried toad parts, or the ashes of burned bees. To our ears, these sound more like witches' brews than medicine, yet they were written down, recommended, and in many cases, sincerely believed to work. Some remedies straddled the line between medicine and magic. For instance, there was a belief that placing a live chicken against the skin of a plague victim could draw out the disease. The chicken, of course, often died in the process, which seemed to confirm the theory. In other cases, people wore amulets containing herbs or animal parts as a form of protection against illness. Garlic, in particular, was seen as a powerful ward, not just against disease, but also against evil spirits. Monks and scholars weren't the only healers. In towns and villages, wise women or cunning folk were often the first point of call for the sick. These women carried oral traditions of herbal knowledge, some of which dated back centuries. They might prepare teas, poultices, or ointments from local plants, often with a blend of Christian prayers and pagan rituals. While the church sometimes viewed them with suspicion, accusing them of witchcraft, communities relied heavily on their skills. Herbs were also prescribed in combination, mixed into elaborate potions. Recipes might call for as many as a dozen ingredients, carefully balanced according to humoral theory. If an illness was thought to be caused by an excess of heat, then cooling herbs like lettuce or cucumber might be included. If it was caused by too much cold, then warming herbs like ginger or pepper would be added. Of course, not all remedies were ingested. Many were applied directly to the skin. Poultices made from mashed herbs were bound over wounds, boils, or sores. Mustard plasters were used to draw out infection, though they often caused burns of their own. A medieval patient with a toothache might be told to chew on cloves, an idea that surprisingly still works today thanks to the natural anesthetic properties of clove oil. But for every sensible practice, there were remedies that seemed shocking. Some treatments involved urine, either drinking it, bathing in it, or using it as an antiseptic wash. Human or animal faces also made their way into recipes, mixed into salves or poultices. The reasoning was not entirely irrational. Dried dung contains bacteria that produce natural antibiotics, yet more often than not, the risks far outweighed the benefits. One of the strangest potions recorded comes from the Leech Book of Bald, an Old English medical text from around the 10th century. It describes a remedy for eye infections that involves mixing garlic and onions with wine and oxgall, then letting the mixture sit in a brass vessel for 9 days. The resulting concoction was then applied directly to the infected eye. As revolting as it sounds, modern scientists tested the recipe and found it surprisingly effective against certain strains of bacteria. A rare case where medieval medicine stumbled onto something genuinely useful. Other remedies were based on the principle of sympathetic magic, the idea that cures like, for example, yellow plants might be prescribed for jaundice because of their color. Red wine might be given to patients suffering from blood disorders because of its resemblance to blood. Walnuts, with their brain-like shape, were thought to be good for mental health. This logic, while not scientific, shaped countless prescriptions. The influence of astrology also crept into the world of potions. Physicians might consult the stars to decide when to gather herbs, believing that plants harvested under certain constellations carried stronger healing powers. A potion brewed under the influence of the moon might be thought to aid fertility, while one prepared under Mars could help in treating fevers. To medieval healers, the universe itself was part of the pharmacy. Yet, despite the strangeness, herbal remedies played a vital role in medieval life. For peasants and nobles alike, they offered the promise of healing in a world where professional physicians were rare and often expensive. Many of these remedies, though wrapped in superstition, provided genuine comfort. A warm herbal tea could soothe a sore throat, a poultice might ease swelling, and the act of being cared for, of receiving treatment, was itself a powerful medicine. It's easy to laugh at the bizarre concoctions, but it's worth remembering that medieval medicine was not entirely misguided. Many modern drugs trace their roots back to plants first used in folk remedies. Digitalis, a treatment for heart disease, comes from foxglove. Morphine was derived from opium poppies. Even aspirin, as mentioned earlier, owes its existence to willow bark. In this sense, the herbalists of the Middle Ages were forerunners of modern pharmacology, even if their recipes often strayed into the grotesque. Still, the line between healing and harm was razor-thin. Without proper dosages or understanding of toxic plants, patients could just as easily be poisoned as cured. Hemlock, belladonna, and mandrake were all used in small amounts for their medicinal properties, but in larger doses they were deadly. A healer's knowledge was a double-edged sword, offering relief or disaster depending on their skill. In the end, herbal remedies and strange potions reflect the mixture of hope and fear that defined medieval medicine. They show us a world where illness was ever present, and where people grasped at whatever tools they had. Whether leaves plucked from a garden, powders ground from bones, or bizarre brews made from toads and worms, these remedies were part science, part ritual, and part desperate faith in forces beyond human understanding. As we leave behind the herbal gardens and smoky kitchens of potion makers, our journey takes us into even darker territory. For nothing tested medieval medicine quite like the arrival of the plague, a terror that swept through towns and villages, leaving physicians scrambling for answers and giving rise to some of the most haunting images in all of history. The Black Death was one of the most terrifying catastrophes in human history, a disease so swift and devastating that it seemed less like an illness and more like divine punishment. Between 1347 and 1351, it swept across Europe with unrelenting force, cutting down a third, and perhaps even half, of the population. It is difficult to overstate the scale of horror it caused. Entire towns vanished. The bells of churches tolled endlessly, ringing not for celebration but for burials, until the sound itself became a symbol of despair. To live in Europe at that time was to live with death at your doorstep, invisible and inescapable, striking down neighbor, friend, parent, or child without warning. For those who endured it, the world must have felt as though it were coming to an end. The plague did not appear suddenly, but traveled along the very routes that connected the medieval world together. From the steppes of Central Asia, it crept westward, borne on fleas that infested the black rats living aboard merchant ships. With trade came death. The disease first appeared in the ports of the Mediterranean. Venice, Genoa, and Marseille beat, for spreading inland like wildfire. The great cities of Paris, Florence, and London soon found themselves gripped by terror. News of the plague traveled faster than the physicians' attempts to explain it, and everywhere people asked the same question: what had caused such a calamity? In a world without the concept of germs or bacteria, theories multiplied, each more desperate than the last. Learned men consulted their astrological charts and declared that a rare alignment of planets had corrupted the air. Others spoke of poisonous vapors rising from the earth, a deadly miasma that spread invisibly through towns and fields. Priests thundered from pulpits that the plague was divine punishment for sin, a scourge sent by God to chastise a wicked people. The ordinary folk, with less need for philosophical explanations, often accepted this judgment and turned to prayer and penance as their only weapons against the invisible killer. The disease itself was as cruel as it was swift. Victims often began with a fever and chills, soon followed by intense pain. Buboes, large, swollen lumps appeared in the armpits or groin, turning black or purple as the body failed. To those who saw them, these swellings seemed like a physical manifestation of corruption, the body rotting even before death. The end usually came within days, leaving little chance for recovery. Some died within 24 hours of showing symptoms, giving the plague an almost supernatural air of inevitability. People watched loved ones go from healthy to dead in a matter of hours. And the terror of such speed dissolved the bonds of trust and compassion that normally tied communities together. Families abandoned the sick to save themselves. Priests fled their parishes, graveyards filled until corpses were left in piles or buried hastily in mass pits. Chroniclers wrote with horror that it seemed as though the very fabric of society had come undone. Faced with such devastation, medieval medicine offered remedies that were as imaginative as they were futile. Bloodletting, the age-old solution for nearly every ailment, was often prescribed. Herbs and flowers were burned or hung around houses to purify the air. People carried small balls filled with spices or soaked cloths pressed to their faces, hoping the sweet smells would ward off the poison thought to be carried in the wind. Some attempted stranger cures. Emeralds crushed into powder and drunk as a potion, pastes of onions and butter applied to the buboes, or even potions of ground toads. One particularly grim method involved strapping a live plucked chicken to the infected swelling, with the belief that the bird would draw out the disease. Others resorted to rubbing their bodies with mercury or arsenic, oblivious to the fact that these so-called cures were deadly in themselves. It was in this desperate atmosphere that the figure of the plague doctor entered history. Although their most iconic outfit, the beaked mask, the long black robes, and the staff became widespread in the 17th century during later outbreaks, the image has become inseparable from the medieval plague. The beak was stuffed with herbs, spices, and vinegar-soaked cloth, thought to purify the air. The staff allowed the doctor to examine patients without direct contact. The overall appearance was terrifying, resembling something more like a bird of death than a healer. In reality, many plague doctors were not highly trained physicians at all. They were often appointed by towns to serve as both medical carers and record keepers, tasked with counting the dead as much as attempting to cure the living. Their presence must have been both a grim reassurance and a reminder that the plague was near. Religion, too, shaped responses in profound ways. If the plague was God's punishment, then penitence was the only answer. Across Europe, processions of flagellants appeared. Men who whipped their own backs until the blood ran, marching barefoot through towns while chanting prayers. They believed that by punishing their own flesh, they could atone for the sins of humanity and beg for God's mercy. Such processions often spread fear rather than comfort, as their songs and cries added to the atmosphere of despair. Others sought comfort in saints and relics, traveling to shrines and praying for protection. Relics of holy men and women were carried through streets, in the hope that they might purify the air. Yet for all this devotion, the plague continued its relentless course. Even the church itself suffered grievously. Priests died in droves. Monasteries lost entire communities, and many towns were left without spiritual guidance. Alongside these official responses, people turned to folk traditions. Garlic was consumed in great quantities, believed to strengthen the body. Charms and amulets were worn, inscribed with words or symbols to repel the disease. Herbs like rosemary and roses were dried and hung in homes, serving as both decoration and supposed protection. In some places, fear turned to hatred, and communities sought scapegoats. Jewish populations were accused of poisoning wells, leading to massacres and expulsions. Such violence revealed how, in the face of an unseen enemy, people sometimes sought someone to blame, no matter how unjustly. Yet even amid the darkness, small sparks of progress appeared. Cities like Venice, realizing that the disease seemed to arrive with ships, began to impose waiting periods before crews and cargo could enter the city. The period was set at 40 days, known in Italian as 40 giorni, giving us the word quarantine. Towns began to record cases, close markets, and restrict movement. Though they did not understand the true cause of the plague, they recognized patterns of transmission and took collective action to protect their people. In these measures, primitive though they were, lay the beginnings of public health. The testimonies of those who lived through the Black Death convey the sheer emotional devastation of the time. In England, chroniclers wrote of villages reduced to 1/10 of their population. In France, carts piled high with corpses rolled through the streets. In Italy, Giovanni Boccaccio described how even family bonds collapsed. As fathers abandoned sons and wives, deserted husbands, all consumed by the terror of infection. These accounts are chilling not only for the scale of death, but for the collapse of human connection. The very thing that makes communities strong. When at last, the first great wave of the plague subsided in the early 1350s, Europe emerged into a changed world. Fields lay empty, towns had shrunk, and labor shortages gave peasants more power to demand wages and better treatment. The economy shifted, social structures were strained, and art and literature were suffused with reminders of death. The grim image of the Dance of Death, where skeletons led the living in a macabre procession, became a common theme in paintings and carvings, a reflection of a generation haunted by mortality. For medicine, the plague revealed the limits of medieval knowledge, but it also forced new attempts at record-keeping and public regulation. The strange beaked masks, the herbal charms, the quarantines, the prayers, and the violent Saul were part of humanity's attempt to grapple with an invisible terror. The Black Death is remembered not only as a calamity, but as a turning point, a moment when fear and desperation collided with ingenuity and resilience. In the end, the Black Death left scars that lasted for centuries. It was not simply a disease, but an experience that shaped the way people thought about life, death, God, and community. It remains one of the darkest reminders of our fragility, but also of the ways human beings, in the face of unimaginable horror, continue to search for meaning, order, and survival. To imagine surgery in the Middle Ages, we must first strip away every comforting idea we associate with modern medicine. There were no gleaming hospital wards, no sterile instruments, no anesthetics, and no understanding of germs. What remained was raw necessity. Surgery was a brutal craft, often performed in dimly lit rooms, on crude wooden tables, or even in the corner of a workshop. It was a trade born of blood and pain, carried out by men whose skills were judged not by compassion but by the speed of their hands and the survival of their patients. At the heart of this world stood the barbers. These men were not scholars in long robes, debating the theories of Hippocrates and Galen at the universities. They were practical craftsmen, often apprenticed from a young age, who learned through observation, repetition, and grim necessity. The link between barbers and surgery might seem strange to us, but in the medieval mind, it made sense. Both required sharp blades, steady hands, and a willingness to deal with blood. A barber who shaved beards and trimmed hair might also be called upon to lance a boil, pull a rotten tooth, or bleed a patient, according to the humoral theories of the day. Over time, these tasks grew into more ambitious undertakings, and the barber-surgeon became a fixture of medieval towns and armies alike. The tools of their trade were simple, often resembling the instruments of a blacksmith more than those of a physician. Iron knives, bone saws, forceps, cautery irons, heated until they glowed red, and hooks for probing wounds were common. There was no stainless steel, no fine precision instruments. A surgeon's kit might be carried in a leather pouch, stained with the dried blood of dozens of previous patients. These tools were rarely, if ever, cleaned between uses. The idea of sterilization lay centuries in the future. If a knife had been used to amputate one man's arm in the morning, it might be used again by afternoon to remove another's leg, carrying unseen infection from one body to the next. Yet the barber-surgeon did not know this. To him, a wound that festered was simply a matter of bad humors or the will of God. The most feared but most common operation was amputation. In a world where war and accident were constant, limbs crushed by falling timber, shattered by weapons, or poisoned by infection often had to be removed. The process was swift, for speed was the only mercy. Assistants would hold the patient down sometimes 2, sometimes 4 while the surgeon prepared his tools. Alcohol might be given to dull the senses, but more often the patient was fully conscious, screaming as the saw bit into bone. Accounts describe men biting down on sticks or leather straps to keep from shattering their teeth. A skilled surgeon could saw through a leg in under 2 minutes. Once removed, the stump was cauterized with a red-hot iron, searing flesh and blood vessels shut in a plume of smoke and the sickening stench of burning flesh. Those who survived the operation faced long and uncertain recoveries, for infection claimed as many lives as blood loss. Other procedures, though less dramatic, were equally painful. Trepanation, the drilling of holes into the skull, was sometimes performed to relieve pressure after head injuries. Patients were restrained while a sharp instrument was twisted into their skulls, scraping away bone. Dental extractions were brutal affairs, with rotten teeth wrenched free by forceps or even pulled by hand. Boils and abscesses were lanced without hesitation, often without any attempt to clean the wound beyond a splash of wine or vinegar. Hemorrhoids were cut away. Bladder stones were sometimes removed by crude incisions, and cataracts were treated by pushing the clouded lens of the eye aside with a needle, leaving patients half-blind but at least able to see some light. Pain relief was a constant challenge, and medieval people turned to a variety of methods, some more effective than others. Alcohol was the most accessible, and patients were often plied with strong wine or spirits until they were barely conscious. Herbal remedies, such as mandrake root, opium poppies, and henbane were sometimes used as sedatives, though their strength was unpredictable and overdoses could be lethal. In rare cases, surgeons created mixtures known as dwell, a concoction of wine, herbs and narcotics intended to induce a deep sleep. But more often than not, patients remained awake, their cries filling the room, their bodies straining against the men who pinned them down. It is difficult for us to imagine the courage or desperation required to submit to such ordeals, knowing the pain that awaited. Despite the brutality, surgery was not entirely blind guesswork. Medieval surgeons worked within the framework of humoral theory, the ancient belief that health depended on the balance of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Wounds were sometimes treated with poultices of herbs to draw out bad humors, and bleeding was carefully managed with the belief that it could restore balance. Wine and vinegar were frequently used to wash wounds, and though the surgeons did not understand why, these substances sometimes reduced infection. There were even manuals of surgery, such as those written by Henry de Mondeville and later Guy de Chauliac, which attempted to systematize knowledge and pass on techniques. Their writings reveal a surprising attention to detailed recommendations for stitching wounds, advice on setting broken bones, and warnings about the dangers of certain procedures. These texts show that surgery, though terrifying, was evolving into a recognized profession with shared standards. On the battlefield, surgeons became essential. Armies marched with barber surgeons in tow, for war produced endless opportunities for their grim skills. Arrows had to be pulled from flesh, cuts sewn closed, and shattered limbs removed. Surgeons used probes to trace the path of projectiles, and devised tools to extract arrowheads lodged deep within the body. The surgeon's tent was often a place of horror, filled with groans and the smell of blood, yet without these crude interventions, many soldiers would have died far sooner. Even in towns, surgery was a public spectacle. Operations were sometimes carried out in open markets or on street corners, with curious crowds gathering to watch. The cries of the patient were part of the entertainment, and surgeons relied on speed not only to save lives, but to demonstrate their skill before an audience. Success brought reputation and customers. Failure meant ridicule or ruin. It was a harsh world, but one in which necessity outweighed fear. Yet amid the horror, there were also glimpses of compassion. Surgeons stitched wounds carefully, knowing that neat work could mean the difference between healing and festering. Some experimented with bandages soaked in honey or wine, substances that, unbeknownst to them, had antibacterial properties. A few sought out the most effective herbs and developed ointments to soothe pain and promote recovery. Though they lacked the science to explain their actions, their instinctive attempts at healing reveal a human desire to lessen suffering, however limited their means. What is striking, perhaps, is how people endured. For the medieval patient, pain was not simply a physical experience, but a spiritual trial. To suffer bravely was to imitate the martyrs and saints, and many believed that pain cleansed the soul. Religious faith often provided a framework that allowed people to face surgery without losing hope. Priests might bless the patient beforehand, prayers were whispered during the procedure, and the sign of the cross was made over the wound. In this way, even the darkest moments of agony were given meaning. Woven into the fabric of faith and endurance that defined medieval life. Looking back, it is easy to recoil at the crude methods and unimaginable suffering of surgery without anesthesia. Yet it was in this crucible of necessity and pain that the roots of modern surgery were forged. The barber surgeons, with their saws and knives, their blood-stained aprons, and rough hands, were the ancestors of today's highly trained specialists. Their world was one of ignorance, but also of bravery and resilience. Each operation, however brutal, was an attempt to save a life in a time when death was always close. And for those who survived, scarred but alive, the ordeal was not only a medical experience, but a testimony to human endurance. When we think of the Middle Ages, no image looms larger in the collective imagination than that of the plague. It was the great shadow that hung over Europe, a darkness that arrived suddenly, spread mercilessly, and left devastation in its wake. Whole villages emptied, towns silenced, and cities haunted by the tolling of bells for the countless dead. For the people who lived through it, the plague was not simply an illness, it was an apocalypse, a punishment, a terror that defied explanation. The most infamous outbreak, of course, was the Black Death of the mid-14th century. It swept into Europe around 1347, carried, as we now know, by fleas on rats, traveling aboard ships. But for medieval people, there was no such understanding. They could not see the invisible bacteria, Yersinia pestis, that caused the disease. Instead, they sought meaning in the signs they could perceive. The stars, the weather, the smells of the air, the sins of humanity. In their eyes, the plague was not a biological event, but a cosmic one, a disruption of balance that could only be explained in moral or spiritual terms. The symptoms were terrifying and swift. A person might wake feeling well in the morning and be dead by nightfall. Fever and chills seized the body, followed by painful swellings, buboes in the groin, armpits, and neck. These swellings turned black as the flesh beneath died, giving the disease its grim name. In some cases, the infection attacked the lungs, producing a bloody cough that spread the sickness even faster. Death was agonizing, and for most, inevitable. Contemporary accounts speak of entire families perishing within days, of carts piled with corpses, of priests too fearful to administer last rites. Faced with such horror, communities scrambled for explanations. Many believed the plague was a punishment from God for the sins of mankind. Preachers warned of divine wrath, and penitential processions wound through the streets, with people whipping themselves in hopes of averting judgment. Others looked to astrology, convinced that a misalignment of planets had poisoned the air. Still others blamed miasmatha, foul smells of swamps, waste, and decayed they thought seeped into the lungs and corrupted the body. The remedies that followed were as varied as they were desperate. People carried posies of herbs and flowers to sweeten the air around them, burned aromatic woods and spices, or held vinegar-soaked cloths to their faces. Physicians prescribed bloodletting, purging, or strange concoctions of crushed emeralds, ground pearls, and rare spices. Few of these measures did anything but provide a sense of control in a world that seemed utterly out of control. One response, however, hinted at a deeper wisdom: quarantine. The idea of isolating the sick was not new, but during the plague years it became systematized. In Venice, officials ordered that ships arriving from infected ports be kept at bay for 40 days before passengers and cargo could disembark. The term quarantine itself comes from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. This practice was born of observation, rather than science. Merchants and magistrates noticed that when the sick were kept apart, the spread slowed. Though they had no knowledge of bacteria, they recognized the patterns of contagion and devised a practical, if brutal, solution. Elsewhere, entire households were boarded up when one member fell ill, locking the healthy inside with the sick. Guards were stationed at city gates to turn away travelers from infected regions. Markets closed, trade routes faltered, and the rhythms of daily life ground to a halt. These measures often bred resentment, for they cut off livelihoods and tore apart families. Yet they were among the few defenses available, and in some places, they made the difference between devastation and survival. But quarantine was not the only social response. Fear also turned inward, seeking scapegoats. In many cities, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells or conspiring to spread the plague. These baseless accusations led to horrific pogroms, with thousands killed in waves of violence that compounded tragedy with cruelty. Such outbreaks of hatred revealed the darker side of humanity's response to fear, the desperate need to blame someone, anyone, for suffering that seemed otherwise inexplicable. Despite the horror, the plague reshaped society in profound ways. With so many lives lost, some estimates suggest a third of Europe's population perished. Labor became scarce. Survivors found that their work was suddenly more valuable, giving peasants and laborers greater bargaining power. Wages rose in some places, feudal bonds weakened, and social mobility, though still limited, became more possible. Land lay empty, fields overgrown, and villages abandoned, but in the long run, these shifts helped break down the rigid structures of medieval society. The catastrophe was also, paradoxically, a catalyst for change. The psychological toll, however, was immense. To live through the plague was to live with constant reminders of death. Art of the period reflected this obsession with mortality, with images of the danse macabre or dance of death, showing skeletons leading kings, peasants, and priests alike to the grave. Writers spoke of the fragility of life, of the vanity of earthly pursuits. For many, the plague deepened religious devotion, but for others, it sowed doubt and despair. If God could allow such suffering, what did that mean for faith? This tension shaped the cultural mood of late medieval Europe, leaving echoes that lingered for centuries. Yet within the tragedy, there were also glimpses of resilience. Communities rebuilt, families carried on, and knowledge slowly grew. Though medicine was powerless to cure the plague, the experience spurred renewed interest in public health. Cities experimented with health boards, record-keeping, and more systematic approaches to contagion. The very concept of quarantine, born in the crisis, became a tool that would be refined and used for centuries to come. In this sense, even amid devastation, human ingenuity found ways to adapt. It is difficult, from the safety of our modern world, to imagine the terror of walking medieval streets during an outbreak. The sound of coughing from behind shuttered windows, the smell of smoke from burning clothes and bedding, the sight of wagons carrying bodies to mass graves. And yet, for the people of the Middle Ages, this was not a single nightmare, but a recurring one. The plague returned again and again in waves, for centuries, sometimes less severe, sometimes devastating anew. It became part of the rhythm of life, a shadow that could never be fully escaped. To understand medieval medicine without considering the plague is impossible, for it shaped not only treatments and policies, but the very way people thought about health, illness, and community. It was a disease that left scars, not just on bodies but on culture, law, faith, and memory. Surgery, herbal remedies, bloodletting, and charms all seemed powerless before it. And yet, the idea of quarantine, a simple act of separation, offered a fragile, imperfect form of protection. It was a sign that even in the darkest times, observation and adaptation could carve out small victories against an overwhelming foe. The plague was a teacher as much as a terror. It taught that illness could spread unseen, that human choices could slow or hasten its course, that survival sometimes depended on collective action. And though those who lived through it lacked the language of microbiology, they carried forward a lesson that still echoes today. When faced with invisible threats, the choices of a community matter as much as the fate of individuals. Medicine in the Middle Ages was never simply about the body. It was a tapestry woven from faith, superstition, observation, and tradition. To fall ill was not only to suffer physically, but to be caught in a web of explanations that reached far beyond the natural world. Disease could come from the stars, from demons, from sin, or from the air itself. And if the causes were mysterious, so too were the cures. Some treatments were rooted in real herbal knowledge that had been passed down for generations, but many were shaped by fear, imagination, and desperation. The result was a landscape of remedies that could be both fascinating and absurd, sometimes effective, often harmless, and occasionally deadly. One of the strangest beliefs was that illness could be transferred from the sick to another object or creature. If you had a fever, you might be advised to sleep with a live chicken pressed against your skin, the bird thought to draw out the heat of the illness. Sometimes the chicken's bare underside would be plucked and held against a bubo, the swollen gland caused by plague, in the hope that the bird would absorb the corruption. In some cases, the bird died likely from suffocation or infection, and this was taken as proof that it had drawn the sickness away. Of course, the patient rarely recovered, but the ritual persisted, a blend of symbolic sacrifice and misplaced hope. Animals were frequently used in remedies. A black dog might be slaughtered, and its blood used in ointments. Toads were dried and ground into powders, or worn alive in pouches around the neck, to ward off plague. Spiders were sometimes mashed into pastes, or even swallowed whole, as a treatment for fevers. The logic was often sympathetic magic, the idea that like could cure like, or that the strange powers of animals could be harnessed for healing. Such remedies sound grotesque to us, but in a world without scientific understanding, they offered a sense of agency, however small. Another approach was the use of charms and amulets. Written words were thought to carry power, especially when they were sacred. A verse from the Bible, a line from a saint's prayer, or even mysterious symbols written on parchment could be worn as protection. Pilgrims returned from shrines carrying tokens that were believed to guard against illness. Rings set with precious stones were recommended by some physicians, each gem said to have a particular influence over the body. Emeralds cooled fevers, sapphires soothed eye troubles, and rubies strengthened the heart. Alchemy and astrology blended seamlessly with medicine. As practitioners drew charts of the heavens to determine the best time for treatments, convinced that the positions of the planets could guide the course of disease. Among the more bizarre cures were those involving bodily fluids. Urine was not only examined as a diagnostic tool, but sometimes consumed as a remedy. Blood, too, was occasionally recommended in small amounts for particular ailments. Even human fat was believed to have medicinal properties. In times of desperation, the line between medicine and superstition blurred into unsettling practices that revealed just how far people were willing to go when facing sickness without answers. Some remedies were rooted in the idea of balance, following the ancient theory of the four humors. If illness was caused by an excess of heat, cold, moisture, or dryness, then the cure was to restore equilibrium. This could mean sweating out a fever, purging the stomach, or bleeding a patient to reduce excess blood. Physicians often prescribed laxatives made from herbs, like senna, or emetics, that induced vomiting. While these treatments sometimes brought relief, they could also weaken the patient dangerously. Still, the framework of humors gave a coherent system to illness, and that system guided countless treatments. Then there were remedies designed to shock the body back into health. For epilepsy, a sufferer might be advised to drink a potion containing powdered human skull. For toothaches, the recommended cure could be to burn the root of a plant and inhale the smoke, or to rub the tooth with a dead mouse. Warts might be treated by rubbing them with bacon and then burying the meat, the belief being that as the bacon decayed, so too would the wart vanish. Each of these treatments reveals a world where symbolism and ritual carried as much weight as practical effect. Religion, of course, played a central role. Pilgrimages to holy sites were common prescriptions, for it was believed that the intercession of saints could heal the sick. Relics, bones, cloth, or even dust associated with holy figures were held close to the afflicted. The act of touching a reliquary, or drinking water from a sacred spring, was thought to cleanse not only the soul but the body. Priests blessed the ill, and exorcisms were performed when sickness was suspected to come from demonic possession. Faith and medicine were deeply entwined, so much so that many people saw no distinction between the two. The communal nature of these cures is striking. Illness was rarely faced alone. Families gathered to pray, neighbors offered advice, and communities performed rituals together. Even when the cure was strange or ineffective, the act of doing something brought a measure of comfort. And though we may laugh at the idea of curing plague with a chicken, or treating fevers with spider paste, it is worth remembering that many of these remedies emerged from patterns of trial and error. A handful of herbs genuinely did ease pain, reduce fevers, or fight infection. Garlic, for example, with its natural antibacterial properties, was valued as a protective herb. Honey, used in ointments, helped prevent wounds from festering. While mixed in with superstition, these fragments of real medicine were the seeds of future discoveries. Some remedies were even surprisingly sophisticated. Distillation, introduced through contact with the Arab world, allowed medieval apothecaries to create concentrated essences of plants. Alcohol-based tinctures became common, used both as medicine and as a preservative. Recipes survive that describe the making of rosewater, mint oil, and camphor solutions, all of which had real therapeutic benefits. While the framework of humors and astrology dominated theory, the practical knowledge of plants, minerals, and preparation techniques offered a quieter, more empirical tradition that coexisted with the more bizarre cures. Superstitions also served a psychological purpose. To believe that a charm could protect against plague, or that burying bacon could heal a wart, was to feel less powerless in the face of the unknown. In a world where sickness could sweep through a village overnight, and where even the best physicians often failed, hope was itself a form of medicine. Belief, ritual, and the comfort of shared traditions gave people resilience, even when their bodies faltered. It is tempting, from our modern perspective, to see medieval cures only as foolish or grotesque. But if we look closely, we find a more complex picture. These remedies reveal a people grappling with mystery, using the tools available to them: faith, imagination, herbs, symbols to make sense of suffering. They show the deep human need for explanation, for action, and for hope. And they remind us that superstition and science are not always so far apart. Many practices once dismissed as nonsense later revealed kernels of truth. The boundary between strange cure and scientific medicine is often only visible in hindsight. In the end, medieval cures tell us less about the diseases themselves than about the people who endured them. They show us fear, but also creativity, desperation, but also resilience, and in the long gallery of human history, they remind us of how far we have come and how much, in the face of illness, we remain the same. For even today, when modern medicine falters, people still turn to charms, rituals, and untested remedies. The medieval world may be centuries behind us, but its echoes linger in surprising ways. When we imagine a hospital today, we think of a great building filled with wards, doctors, nurses, and medicines, a place where science and care come together, where the sick are treated with specialized knowledge and the most advanced technology available. In the Middle Ages, however, hospitals were very different institutions. They were not primarily about curing disease in the modern sense. Instead, they were places of charity, of refuge, and of spiritual healing. To step into a medieval hospital was to enter a world shaped less by medicine than by faith, community, and the conviction that caring for the sick was a holy duty. The origins of these hospitals lay in religious practice. Christianity placed great emphasis on works of mercy, and among the most sacred of these was caring for the ill, the poor, and the abandoned. Monasteries, with their wealth, organization, and devotion, became the natural centers of this kind of charity. As early as the 4th and 5th centuries, monastic communities were establishing infirmaries for their own members. By the Middle Ages, these infirmaries had expanded into hospitals that served not just monks, but also pilgrims, travelers, and the needy. They were not hospitals in the scientific sense, but houses of care, combining elements of almshouses, guest houses, and hospices. In these institutions, the sick were taken in not because it was expected they would be cured, but because it was believed that tending to them was a holy act. To wash the sores of the afflicted, to feed those too weak to feed themselves, to pray with those near death, these were seen as acts of devotion. Many hospitals were attached to churches or cathedrals. their wards laid out so that patients could see and hear the Mass from their beds. Healing was as much about saving the soul as about easing the body. For many, to die in a hospital, under the care of the Church, was to ensure that their passing was accompanied by prayer and ritual, preparing them for the life to come. That does not mean that hospitals offered no medical care. Monks and nuns often learned rudimentary treatments, growing herbs in cloister gardens, preparing ointments, and practicing simple procedures. A medieval hospital might provide broths and wines to strengthen the weak poultices to soothe wounds, or balms to ease pain. The emphasis, however, was on comfort rather than cure. To care for the sick was to imitate Christ, who healed the afflicted and showed compassion to the suffering. Hospitals were as much spiritual sanctuaries as they were places of rest. Pilgrims were a major presence in medieval hospitals. As people traveled across Europe to visit holy shrines, they often fell ill along the way. Hospitals were built along pilgrimage routes, offering beds to travelers who had exhausted themselves in their journeys. Some hospitals became famous for their associations with relics, claiming that contact with the holy could cure disease. Pilgrims might drink from a sacred spring, touch a relic housed in a hospital chapel, or sleep in a bed believed to carry healing power. The line between religious devotion and medical treatment was thin, and in many cases, it was the same thing. The organization of these hospitals was often impressive. Large institutions like the Hotel Yé in Paris or the Hospital of Santa Maria della Scala in Siena were vast complexes, with hundreds of beds, kitchens, chapels, and staff. The architecture reflected their dual purpose: to provide care and to glorify God. Wards were often long halls with rows of beds, sometimes without much privacy, but always under the watchful gaze of religious figures. Inscriptions and decorations reminded both patients and caretakers that sickness was a trial of the soul, and that endurance and faith were paths to salvation. Not all hospitals were vast or wealthy. In many towns, small hospitals cared for only a handful of patients, run by local priests, or supported by charitable donations from guilds and wealthy patrons. Some catered to particular groups: the poor, widows, orphans, or lepers. Leper hospitals, or leprosaria, were often placed on the outskirts of towns, both to isolate the afflicted and to provide them with a community of their own. Though feared and stigmatized, lepers were not always abandoned. In many places, they were offered housing, food, and spiritual care in dedicated institutions. A reflection of the medieval balance between fear of disease and duty of charity. Life inside these hospitals was shaped by routine. Patients would rise with the dawn, pray with the community, and be given simple meals. Nurses, often lay brothers or sisters, would tend to their needs, changing bedding, cleaning wounds, and offering words of comfort. Priests provided sacraments, ensuring that the spiritual health of the patient was never neglected. In some places, music was played in the wards, or readings from scripture were offered to soothe the afflicted. While the medical treatments were limited, the environment of care, order, and attention often brought relief. In a world where the sick might otherwise be left alone, the hospital provided human connection. There was also a sense of hierarchy within these spaces. Wealthier patients might have access to private rooms, while the poor shared crowded halls. Donations and endowments often secured better treatment, or at least more comfortable survival. Yet even for the humblest, the hospital offered something rare in the medieval world: a place where illness was not simply endured, but where others took responsibility for the sufferer. One cannot overlook the role of women in these institutions. Nuns, lay sisters, and widows formed the backbone of nursing care. Their work was hard and often thankless, washing the dying, cleaning wounds, and tending to the helpless, but it was also considered holy. To serve the sick was to serve Christ himself. In many hospitals, women held positions of authority, overseeing wards and managing resources. Their contribution to medieval medicine was immense, even if it was rarely recognized in the scholarly tradition of physicians and surgeons. Over time, hospitals began to evolve. Contact with Islamic medicine, with its more advanced medical knowledge, slowly influenced European practices. Hospitals in the later Middle Ages began to pay more attention to hygiene, separating patients by type of illness, and incorporating new treatments. Though still rooted in faith, these changes marked the beginning of a shift toward more medicalized care. By the 15th century, some hospitals even had trained physicians on staff, blending charity with a growing interest in science. To walk through the halls of a medieval hospital would have been to encounter a mix of suffering and sanctity. The groans of the sick mingled with the chants of monks, the smell of herbs with the scent of incense. Candles burned before crucifixes as nurses moved quietly between beds. For many patients, healing might not come in the form of restored health, but in the comfort of being cared for, prayed over, and accompanied in suffering. These places remind us that medicine is not only about curing, but also about compassion. The story of medieval hospitals is, in the end, a story about community. They reveal how societies responded to vulnerability, how faith shaped care, and how people sought meaning in the face of illness. They were not hospitals as we know them, but they were essential, providing dignity, shelter, and hope to those who might otherwise have been forgotten. In their mixture of charity and faith, they tell us something timeless: that to care for the sick is one of the most human acts, binding us together across centuries. Few words in history strike as much fear as plague. For medieval people, pestilence was a constant shadow, a threat that could sweep through towns and villages with little warning, leaving death and despair in its wake. The most infamous of these outbreaks, the Black Death of the 14th century, stands as one of the most devastating events in human history. But plague was not an isolated horror. It was part of a wider reality in which disease shaped daily life, belief, and even the course of kingdoms. To live in the Middle Ages was to live with the ever-present possibility of epidemic, and with it, a struggle to explain, endure, and survive. The Black Death arrived in Europe in the late 1340s, carried by ships traveling along the trade routes that connected east and west. It spread with terrifying speed, moving inland from ports and across countrysides, striking down rich and poor alike. Contemporary accounts describe towns where entire streets were left silent, houses abandoned, families wiped out in a matter of days. The symptoms were unmistakable: swelling of the lymph nodes, dark blotches on the skin, fever, and death within a week. The mortality was staggering. Some regions lost a third of their population, others even more. In some places, the dead were so numerous that they were buried in mass graves, the earth unable to keep pace with the devastation. To the people who lived through it, the plague was incomprehensible. Medieval medicine had no knowledge of bacteria or transmission by fleas and rats. Instead, explanations were sought in the movements of the stars, in the corruption of the air, or in divine punishment for human sin. Physicians published treatises advising people to avoid foul odors, to burn herbs, to cleanse the air, or to carry posies of flowers against infection. The phrase, "a pocketful of posies," survives even now as a trace of these practices. Others turned to prayer, fasting, or processions, believing that repentance might turn away God's wrath. The social impact was profound. Fear of contagion drove people apart. Families abandoned their sick, neighbors refused to help one another, and in many towns, the normal bonds of society broke down. Priests and nuns, often the only ones willing to care for the afflicted, died in great numbers. Fields went untended, markets were deserted, and trade ground to a halt. The very rhythm of life was disrupted, replaced by silence, mourning, and uncertainty. Yet the plague did not strike only once. Outbreaks recurred throughout the later Middle Ages, returning in waves that kept populations in a state of dread. Every generation seemed to know its own version of pestilence. Whether it was the great pandemic of the 14th century or the localized outbreaks that followed, the memory of sudden overwhelming death lingered, shaping attitudes toward life, faith, and the body. One of the most haunting aspects of plague culture was the art and literature it inspired. Images of the danse macabre, the dance of death, appeared in murals and manuscripts, showing skeletons leading men and women of all stations in a grim procession. The message was clear: death spares no one. Kings, bishops, merchants, peasants, all were equal in the face of pestilence. Such imagery served as both a warning and a comfort, reminding the living of their mortality, but also suggesting a strange kind of unity in the shared fate of humanity. The plague also intensified suspicions and fears. In times of crisis, people sought scapegoats, and in many towns, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells or spreading disease. These accusations led to violence, persecution, and massacres, deepening the tragedy of the epidemic. Such actions reveal the darker side of human responses to disaster. The tendency to blame others when explanations are lacking and fear is overwhelming. Yet amidst the devastation, there were also changes that reshaped society. The dramatic reduction in population altered the balance of labor and wealth. With fewer workers, peasants and artisans could demand better wages and conditions. In some regions, this shift contributed to the decline of serfdom and the gradual transformation of the medieval economy. Land was abandoned, villages disappeared. But opportunities opened for survivors, who could take up farms or trades once closed to them. The plague was not only a tragedy, it was also a turning point that set in motion profound changes in European history. Medical practice, too, was forced to adapt. Physicians recorded their observations, however limited, and tried to learn from each outbreak. Quarantines were introduced in Italian city-states, where ships suspected of carrying plague were held offshore for 40 days, the origin of the word quarantine. Towns experimented with isolation, closing gates, and regulating movement, though they did not understand the true cause. These measures sometimes slowed the spread of disease. laying the groundwork for public health practices in the centuries to come. For ordinary people, however, survival often seemed a matter of chance. Some fled the cities for the countryside, believing that cleaner air offered safety. Others sought protection and devotion, carrying charms or praying to saints associated with healing. Saint Roch, who was believed to have survived plague, became especially venerated. His image often carried in hopes of warding off infection. At the same time, some turned to hedonism, reasoning that if death could come at any moment, one might as well enjoy the pleasures of life while it lasted. Accounts speak of feasting, revelry, and indulgence taking place, alongside scenes of mourning and despair. The psychological toll of the plague cannot be overstated. For generations, the fear of sudden, unstoppable disease haunted the European imagination. Writers described a world turned upside down, where the normal order of things had collapsed. To some, the plague was a reminder of human fragility. To others, a sign of the world's corruption and the nearness of the apocalypse. It shaped theology, reinforcing themes of sin, judgment, and the fleeting nature of earthly life. Even centuries later, the memory of the Black Death remained a touchstone in collective memory, a measure of catastrophe against which all other disasters were compared. And yet, life did go on. After each outbreak, people rebuilt, replanted, and repopulated. Towns filled again with markets and laughter, fields grew green, and families returned to their rhythms. The resilience of medieval communities in the face of such devastation is as striking as the horror of the disease itself. They endured, adapted, and carried forward, leaving us not only the memory of loss, but also the example of persistence. To walk through a medieval street during plague years would have been to feel both fear and silence hanging in the air. Shutters closed, carts carrying the dead, priests chanting prayers, the smell of smoke and decay. But alongside that darkness, there was also the flicker of candles in hospital chapels, the determination of nurses and monks, and the quiet courage of those who stayed to care for others. The story of plague is not only a story of death, but also of how people faced death with terror. Yes, but also with compassion, creativity, and endurance. The great pestilences of the Middle Ages remind us that history is not only about battles and kings, but about the unseen struggles of survival against forces beyond human control. They reveal a world where science was limited, but faith and community sought to fill the void. They shaped societies in ways that still echo today, in our institutions, our art, and our awareness of vulnerability. To speak of plague is to speak of both fragility and resilience, of a shadow that darkened centuries, but that also illuminated the enduring will to live. When we look back on medieval medicine, it is tempting to focus only on the strangeness, the superstition, and the suffering. Leeches and bloodletting, charms and prayers, amputations without anesthesia, all paint a picture of a world both alien and frightening. And yet, the story of medicine in the Middle Ages is not simply one of ignorance or cruelty. It is also a story of continuity, of learning and adaptation, of steps however small, that paved the way for the science and practices that would follow. The legacy of medieval medicine is complex, woven from both failure and progress, and it deserves to be seen in its full light. At its core, medieval medicine was shaped by the inheritance of ancient traditions. The writings of Hippocrates and Galen, preserved and transmitted through the centuries, provided the foundation upon which much of medieval practice rested. These classical texts, interpreted through the lens of medieval scholarship, offered a framework for understanding the body and its ailments. The theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile dominated medical thought, guiding diagnosis and treatment for centuries. Though we now know that such a system bore little relation to biological reality, it gave structure and consistency to the practice of medicine at a time when little else was understood. What kept this tradition alive was not only Europe, but the wider world. In the Islamic Golden Age, scholars preserved and expanded upon the works of the ancients. Figures like Avicenna and Averroes wrote encyclopedias and commentaries that synthesized Greek philosophy with new observations and experiments. These works crossed into Europe through translations in Spain and Italy, profoundly influencing medieval physicians. The Canon of Medicine, by Avicenna, became one of the most important medical texts of the Middle Ages, studied in universities, and copied across the continent. Thus, medieval medicine was never a purely European phenomenon. It was part of a larger web of knowledge stretching across cultures and languages. The establishment of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries gave new life to medical learning. In places like Bologna, Paris, and Montpellier, students gathered to study anatomy, philosophy, and the teachings of past masters. Here, medicine became a profession distinct from folk healing or monastic care. Physicians trained in these universities might wear robes and caps that set them apart, their learning granting them a place of respect in society. Though their treatments remained bound to humoral theory, Their role as educated interpreters of illness marked an important step toward professionalization. At the same time, practical medicine never disappeared. Barbers, surgeons, midwives, and apothecaries continued to serve the daily needs of communities. They mixed remedies from herbs, performed surgeries, and delivered children. Their knowledge was not always written down, but it was rooted in experience and tradition. In many ways, the survival of ordinary people depended more on these practitioners than on university-trained physicians. This dual system of learned medicine on one side and practical medicine on the other was one of the defining features of the medieval period, and one that shaped the structure of healthcare for centuries. The medieval period also left behind tools, practices, and institutions that would have long-lasting effects. Hospitals, for example, began as places of charity, often attached to monasteries. They were less about curing disease and more about offering shelter, food, and prayer to the sick and poor. Yet these early hospitals laid the foundation for the idea of communal care, a tradition that continued into the modern world. Even the practice of keeping patients together in dedicated buildings was a step toward the development of organized healthcare systems. Public health also began to take tentative steps forward. The quarantines first introduced in Italian city-states during plague outbreaks set precedents for managing epidemics. Town councils began to regulate sanitation, order the cleaning of streets, or remove waste from public spaces. Though often motivated by fear of miasma, the belief that bad air spread disease, such measures occasionally had real benefits. The medieval city, with its crowded streets and open sewers, was a dangerous environment for health. But the beginnings of civic responsibility toward cleanliness marked a slow shift in awareness. In surgery, too, progress was uneven but significant. Medieval surgeons developed techniques for setting bones, stitching wounds, and even performing rudimentary forms of cataract surgery. They wrote manuals describing their procedures, complete with illustrations of instruments. Some surgeons, such as Guy de Chauliac, became renowned for their skill. Their works copied and studied long after their deaths. Though limited by pain and infection, these practitioners laid down traditions of observation and record-keeping that would influence later generations. The legacy of medieval medicine also lies in its relationship to faith. For many people, illness was not simply a physical condition, but a spiritual trial. Pilgrimages to holy sites, prayers to saints, and the use of relics all formed part of the healing experience. While modern science often dismisses such practices as superstition, they reveal a different understanding of health, one in which body and soul were inseparable. This holistic vision may not have cured disease, but it offered comfort, meaning, and community, which were powerful forms of healing in themselves. The failures of medieval medicine are plain to us now, but they also teach us something valuable. They remind us how difficult it is to understand the body without the tools of modern science, and how as human beings create systems of belief to explain the unknown. They remind us, too, that progress is not always a straight line. The medieval world was not waiting passively for modernity to arrive. It was actively grappling with the problems of health and disease using the knowledge it had. Its successes and errors alike are part of the story of how medicine grew. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval legacy is one of persistence. Despite the limitations, people sought healing. They experimented with herbs, they recorded symptoms, they shared knowledge across borders, they cared for one another in hospitals and homes. In times of plague, when death seemed unstoppable, they still lit candles, said prayers, and offered what comfort they could. The spirit of seeking health, of alleviating suffering, endured even in the darkest of times. When we reflect on medieval medicine, then, we see more than bloodletting and superstition. We see the beginnings of institutions, the transmission of knowledge, the persistence of care, and the resilience of human communities in the face of disease. We see the early steps on a long road that leads to our own hospitals, our own doctors, and our own ongoing struggles with illness. The Middle Ages may feel distant, but their shadow lingers in the very structures of health and healing we rely on today. The story of medieval medicine, in all its strangeness and suffering, is also a story of continuity. It tells us that human beings, across centuries, have always sought to understand the mysteries of the body, to explain sickness, and to find ways to cure it. It tells us that progress is built not only on brilliance, but also on trial, error, and endurance. And it tells us that even in an age of fear and death, people held on to hope, and through that hope, left us a legacy far richer than we might first imagine. And so we leave behind the world of medieval medicine, with its bloodletting and leeches, its charms and prayers, its surgeons and their crude instruments. It was an age of uncertainty, of trial and error, and often of terrible suffering. Yet within that world were the seeds of progress, the beginnings of hospitals, the careful observations of physicians, the traditions of healing that would slowly, over centuries, evolve into modern science. To us, Their methods may seem barbaric or misguided, but they remind us that every step forward is built on the struggles of those who came before. Medieval medicine was not simply a story of failure, but a chapter in the longer human effort to make sense of sickness, to fight against pain, and to cling to hope in the face of death. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, I invite you to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more explorations of history's hidden and fascinating corners. Thank you for listening, and until next time, may you rest easy as the echoes of history fade gently into the night.